aging is not a liability. Aging is a force for good. Actually, it's a blessing to be able to age, to live to an old age. I come from a humble family. My parents were selling vegetables at the market. I would say that I have a lot of care and attention by my late grandmother together with my brothers and sisters, because both my father and mother were busy working in the market. And when my grandmother lost her mobility, I was like the main caregiver. So you can say that every time I look at other older adults, I feel like they are like my grandmother. I was in the army for 29 years. So when I was training with the US Army in Virginia, the US Army Logistics University, then I was asking myself, what should I do after I leave army? So when you are alone overseas for quite a period, right, the natural tendency is that we will miss out the food. And a lot of time it's not just about the char kway teow, the mee po or coffee, but it's about the food that bring you fond memories. The food that I miss most was the teochew mueh that my grandmother cooked for me. Simple white teochew mueh with the chai sim, gana chai. So there was one time I traveled to San Francisco, LA, and then I go to the Chinatown. Then I bought some of this. So when I eat the teochew mueh and with that gana chai and the chai sim, it just brings back a lot of memories of my grandmother. And then I reflected quite deeply on this law. Since I have a natural affection for older adults, and I have being blessed to receive the love from my grandmother, how can I use this affection and love for other older adults and also bring the same smile and laughter to more older adults? So I decided that I came back, then I signed up for the gerontology program. So AIC, like the name connotes, right? We are agency for integrated care. So we integrate the care with the older adult right in the center. The whole intent is to create a vibrant community to support our older adults to live well and age well. In AIC, they need someone to lead the Silver Generation Office. So I was approached, and of course, it's so close to my heart. So I decided to join this organization. I think in this time where we are moving fast into a super aging society, one of the roles to engage older adults is most important. It is a calling in a sense, and I hope that I can use my knowledge, my study in gerontology to apply in the work with my colleagues and also the partners in the community so that we can support the older adults to age well and age actively, and then they can continue to remain happy, healthy, and also live meaningfully.